righty, welcome everyone. Today's webinar is covering very exciting topic, launching your SOW program and the ultimate starter kit to do that. I am joined with Daniel Schmidt, our Flentis product manager, and Michael Matherly, VP of Global IC Compliance and SOW at eTeam. Thank you guys for joining me.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Of course. So today we're going to be answering a lot of questions about SOW, talking about processes, technology that goes along with an SOW program. Before we jump into all of that, want to let our audience know that we will be doing a Q&A at the end of the hour. We'll be able to answer all of your questions live here on the webinar. I am Laura Moritz, Vice President of Product Development and Implementation for Flentis and part-time webinar host. I will be moderating the webinar today. Before we jump into it though, can you each just give a quick intro of who you are, kind of what we're going to be doing here today? Michael, if we'll start with you.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Laura and Daniel, for having me. My name is Michael Matherly, and as Laura said, I'm the VP Global Head of IC Compliance and SOW at eTeam. I just joined eTeam this year to build out their SOW and AOR IC Compliance program. My background, for those of you who don't know me, started on the procurement side, managing professional services and contingent labor at Capital One. I've built VMS functionality and programs, and then I went over to the dark side, to the sell side, about 15 years ago, and have supported MSPs and VMSs, and super glad to be here to talk about my favorite topic, SOW.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. Daniel, if you'll just give a quick intro of yourself.
Of course. So like Laura said, I'm Daniel Schmidt. I'm our product manager here at Flentis. I've spent my entire career in the contingent workforce space. I actually started on the operations side of things, doing MSP program management, and I eventually moved over to doing implementations here within Flentis. Just loved it so much, and now I've taken all my knowledge that I've learned from implementing and managing programs and have landed here in the product development side of things. So really excited to talk to you about what we have in terms of services procurement for Flentis today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. All right, let's get into it. So before we kind of dive directly into SOW, I want to take a bit of a step back and kind of talk about exactly what do we mean. And I think if we can just step all the way back to what is an external workforce and kind of what are the different components of that. And then we can get a little bit more specific into the SOW space as we go. So Daniel, I'll start with you, and then Michael will let you kind of play off of that.
All right, sounds good. So typically when I like to think about external workforce, and I'm maybe explaining it to someone who's not super familiar with it, I usually refer to it as individuals or teams or who are not necessarily directly employed by an organization, but they still contribute to their day-to-day operations. So that can include things like freelancers, contractors, consultants, and temporary workers. So for example, those contingent workers, if we're talking about freelancers, those might be independent professionals who offer a specialized skill set, and it's more on a project basis type of work, which falls under kind of the services procurement umbrella, which obviously we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about today. Whereas maybe temporary workers kind of fall under that staff augmentation side of things, and those are staff hired for those short-term needs and usually hired through those staffing agencies. So I think there's a lot of different components too about contingent workforce, different benefits and things like that. So I just want to go over some of those as well. So I would say one of the first benefits of having contingent workforce within your organization is flexibility. And it really, having that contingent workforce allows organizations to scale their workforce either up or down. The goal obviously being up. You can fulfill projects quickly and hire based on those market conditions. Also a benefit is the cost effectiveness. This obviously reduces costs associated with full-time employees, such as things like benefits and other long-term commitments. I think another really important one is access to those specialized skill sets that those external workers may have. And it also gives organizations more time to focus on core activities for their other internal resources, whereas the contingent labor may be able to handle other specific areas or tasks. So,
Fantastic. Oh, go ahead.
just a little bit more to add. I think with those benefits also comes some challenges and considerations. The first thing would be talking about kind of integration, ensuring those external workers are effectively integrated into that organization, and they cooperate well with the existing team and just overall, business workflow. Management, kind of requires that effective management to oversee those contingent workers, and there's different areas and aspects in how you manage contingent workers versus your full-time employees, as they do kind of have different policies put in place sometimes. So speaking of that compliance, you need to adhere to kind of the legal and the regulatory items related to the external labor. So for example, employment laws, taxing, things like that. And then finally, quality control, just maintaining consistency and quality and monitoring performance, which of course, all of those things can be handled and done within a VMS like ours.
Perfect. Michael, anything that you want to add on to that?
Anything you want me to add on to that mic drop of an answer?
I know, right? I'm like, very thorough response. So if you can add anything.
I was thinking maybe I'll give a bullet point or two and call it a day,
Sure.
But we went to town on that one. Look, the only thing I'll answer or address is, that's what the external workforce is. I think an equally important question, I know we'll get into it, is how they're engaged. So since we're talking about SOW a fair amount today, SOW is a vehicle to engage one or two of those different types of external workforce. And it's different than the standard PO that you might engage a temp labor staffing firm contractor by. And that's what creates all the challenges, the uniqueness, the complexities, but also the opportunity to manage SOW versus and separately and distinct from temp labor.
And I think that's kind of a perfect way to dive into SOW more specifically. Is there anything else, Michael, that you can highlight as far as differentiators between SOW and staff aug? I know they're kind of talked about pretty separately in the industry, but I think sometimes there's confusion as far as what falls under which bucket.
Yeah, no, and it's been an age-old confusion in our industry, and understandably so, because the reality is you can use an SOW to buy staff aug services. There's no rule or law against it. It's just a matter of practice. It's a matter of what procurement and sourcing organizations refer to as segmentation. So when you talk about segmenting the spend, you consume temp labor or staff aug resources considerably different than you should, best practice wise, consume SOW-based services. And the reason is because SOWs allow you to be a little bit more specific with the deliverables, the project expectations, the results that you're looking for. And one good way to think about it is if you have a properly done SOW and you don't get the delivery you're expecting, you have remedies within the contract. You can withhold payment. You can require the consulting firm or the freelancer to fix it if it doesn't meet acceptance criteria. But on the temp labor or staff aug side, you have no remedy other than to terminate or early terminate the assignment. And that's by design, and companies need to recognize that those are your levers to manage those two different. The other thing I would mention is the standardization that really is the cornerstone of the foundation of our industry, and why temp staffing really launched the MSP business and launched the VMS business, because there was such standardization of, a job rec, a job description, a requisition workflow, the submission of resumes as the proposal, if you will, or the response to a request. Standardizing that process, including like purchase orders and rates per hour and stuff like that, very subject and lends itself well to automation and efficiencies, in an organization that buys a lot of temp staffing or staff augmentation resources. But when you switch over to the SOW side, you lose a lot of that standardization. And that's why you need a specially designed SOW functionality like Flentis has built, and like my team at eTeam helps companies manage, is to fill the gaps that the standardization doesn't fill on the process. And I know we'll be getting to that a little bit more, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Perfect. Daniel, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the question of how does SOW differ from staff aug is definitely really interesting. And Michael brought up a lot of good points. But in terms of the technology perspective, while there may be different workflows, for example, approval process that can be input into a VMS, at the end of the day, within our services procurement module and just in our system as a whole, you can manage both staff augmentation and services procurement all in one place. Even if you're implementing services procurement at a later date, it's very easy to quickly turn it on, configure it, set it up, and really get going and all manage it under one system.
Yeah, I think that's important to think about is it can all be under one program, although they are handled pretty separately in the business. So want to just drill down a little bit on kind of the SOW population and what is the makeup of that. I think Daniel kind of in his intro, I believe, mentioned kind of an independent contractor. I think that's a lot of times something that's thought of when it comes to SOW. But Michael, can you maybe just speak to what is everything that can fall into that bucket?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to be careful when we ask to what everything can versus should. And the difference between can and should is kind of a maturity of an organization with regards to how they segment their spend and how they manage those individual segments to their benefit for, whether it's efficiency, effectiveness, savings, risk management of contract terms and so forth. But from an SOW perspective, you mentioned, I think we all are aware that you can put different types of spend or different type of engagements on there. Generally, when we think of SOW, you think of a project-based or deliverable-based or something where you're expecting an outcome. And that's absolutely right. And that's the highest and best use of an SOW. But the reality is you can engage a consulting firm, a large project firm to do a huge program, a small deliverable. But you can also use an SOW to engage a freelancer as an independent contractor, where you identify what the expectation is from that freelancer and from that IC during the engagement. There's really no difference in that regard. Now, there's some difference in the onboarding and how you get to the SOW for a C2C, corp to corp, or for an IC, and we might touch on that a little bit later. But the expectation is that the SOW is going to govern your expectations. Both parties' expectations, and that's by design. So that's the highest and best use of it. But from a reality standpoint, our industry has been using SOW, and again, understandably so. And I think it's helped us transition to this new services procurement era. Been using SOW to engage staff augmentation, and that's okay. So what has happened is now that we've got SOW functionality, we've got MSPs and VMSs offering up SOW management services, we're seeing that a lot of hourly work, if you will, time and materials are still being put on SOW. Some of it makes sense and is by design, like if you have an offshore team where you got a lot of different people working on different initiatives, it's okay and reasonable to set up hourly rates and a rate card. But it does leave you exposed a little bit to whether you're going to be getting the expected results or not. The one thing, as I mentioned earlier, is what's your remedy if the worker who's working on an hourly basis, even on an SOW, isn't held to the acceptance criteria or to the delivery of the service that you're expecting. if it's a time and materials and you don't have acceptance criteria or have a well-drawn contract, then you're still, you're no better off than you were if you had just hired a temp labor staff augmentation contractor.
Absolutely. And to kind of, there are a lot of different things within an organization that really could be classified either way. And how, now I use could, again, should they be is a different story. But how can an organization be confident that they are capturing everything when you're looking at all of these different types of contracts and contract vehicles and things like that? Can you speak to a little bit to that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's really the value that a well-developed and fully functional VMS like Flentis offers is the ability to effectively automate contract compliance, commercial term compliance within the system. So if you imagine an organization who enters into SOWs on paper with the supplier, and then they both execute it, and then you start a project, and you just wait for the supplier to send their invoice in an email. If you've got a $500,000 or any size project, really, that becomes really difficult to keep track of. And the real value of a VMS is very basic. It's kind of low-hanging fruit, where you don't need to do that anymore. One, it's risky because there's a lot of waste, right? There's, you don't know if it takes a lot of effort for the AP department to get all their approvals and signatures. And then somebody has to have a copy of the SOW to look at what the acceptance criteria is. So there's a lot of manual activities just in receiving the invoice and paying it. But when you have a system like Flentis to support that, you're taking the terms from the SOW and you're basically creating a digital representation of those commercial terms in Flentis, and they're actually providing the control for you, right? So if you have a deliverable ABC, which is, for $50,000 and it requires acceptance criteria and there's no interim payment, then you can tell Flentis to track that for you. And the supplier, they can submit their payment request or their invoice, but they're forced to attach the acceptance criteria documentation, and then it has to go to the manager, if you so configure it, to review it. And you can even force your internal people, and I use the word force, and that's not a great word, but you can control the process by requiring that even the receiving manager downloads the acceptance criteria and then signs off on it. So all that is required before you pay that $50,000. It took me a few minutes to describe that, but the reality is within Flentis, you could have processed an invoice like that and checked acceptance criteria in the amount of time it took me to tell you about it. That's the efficient value of using a VMS to govern your SOW contracts, even at a very basic level. And notice I didn't talk about how you develop the contract or how you source it and source or choose the vendor. Those are opportunities, but it's not the core benefit of using a VMS or an MSP to help you manage your SOW spend.
Absolutely. Daniel, anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, Michael, you made a lot of really good points. And a lot of them were very detailed. There's specific workflows that kind of need to happen within sometimes a complex statement of work. And what my team and I really focused on when we were building out this services procurement module is that, kind of the devil's in those details. We want to make sure we're capturing every workflow and process and approval and making it obvious to the user kind of what the next step is, where it's held, where you need to action things. Otherwise, you're kind of just going back to the basics of scrambling around to check an email or a spreadsheet to see if something was signed off and approved. And ultimately, that one small little mistake of not being able to review that acceptance criteria, for example, like you mentioned, could lead to a bigger issue of, sending out a huge payment when really it shouldn't be approved.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm glad you brought that up because I look back on last year when we were working together to develop some requirements and kind of, as you guys were solutioning what the SOW module would look like. And I really appreciate working with you guys. looking at the detail, and I applaud you guys for taking the time to pay attention to the details, to really make sure that you're understanding the different use cases of your stakeholders at your customer side, but also the suppliers that are interacting through your VMS with your customer. Those details matter when you're managing compliance. The details matter when you're trying to automate as much of a complex process or set of processes as you can. And that detail, when the Flentis team built that into the program, it all became highly configurable so that your customers can really do their own solutioning of how they want to manage or bring SOW management within their organization to life, right? So like that example of the acceptance criteria being required, or the upload of acceptance criteria documentation, all that's configurable within Flentis. So if you have a mature organization, trying to govern a very mature bucket of spend, you can actually get to a very fine level of detail within Flentis to control. But the flip side of that is it's not a one size fits all. And I know we were going to get to this later, so I apologize. I sort of stumbled into this. The ability to actually say, we're not very detail oriented. We're a very basic shop. We're still using AP to process invoices received through email. We use supplier paper still. You can still use, and you'll see that there's an opportunity to use Flentis to upload even those what you might consider unmanaged or severely undermanaged today. You can still get that commercial contract term compliance benefit from day one using this technology. And I think that's the real exciting part about this and especially since we're talking about how to launch an SOW program, you guys have provided easy pathways into your system and into better SOW management. So I better stop there, or I'm going to ruin the rest of the story.
Just keep going, Michael. You can just talk for the rest of the hour and we'll just listen. That's actually the perfect segue, because and you hinted at it earlier as well, actually, when you were talking about that you hadn't even touched on the sourcing part of it, and we had already talked about all of these benefits. And I think that something that you introduced me to, almost years ago at this point, is the entry point methodology. And as I was kind of learning what an SOW program was made of, and we were just in the beginning phases of building out the technology, this is something that really made it make sense to me. So do you mind kind of just walking our audience through what we're talking about here?
Yeah. And I don't want people to be intimidated by this graphic. It's actually pretty simple once we break it down. If you look at on the left-hand side, you can see there's the three major channels of contingent labor, or the external workforce: temp labor, non-agency contractors, and corp-to-corp SOW, which is kind of a big catch-all. But then across the top, you see the different phases of engaging those labor channels. So there's sourcing, selecting the right vendor or selecting the right temp labor contractor, selecting the right IC. And then there's contracting. On the temp labor side, you just put a standard purchase order in place. But for an IC who you're putting on an SOW, or corp to corp you're putting SOW, you have to negotiate and build that contract. But then finally, whichever channel you're in, once you get the agreement set and you start the assignment, that's where you're really focused on, the order's been created, you're focused on maintaining compliance with the commercial terms of the arrangement, the SOW particularly. And that's what we refer to as entry point one, where it doesn't matter per se how you selected the vendor or how you ended up into a contract or an SOW with them. When we talk about entry point one in the entry point methodology, we're talking about just getting the commercial terms built into a system to engage those digital records to help you control and maintain compliance. But the other thing that it does is look at the optimization piece of it. If you're in an organization that is not managing your SOW spend with a VMS or a significant portion of it, then you're missing out on a whole lot of opportunity for reporting and analytics and segmentation and category development opportunities. And that's what that optimization phase is. But to sort of step back and look at what the entry point methodology, the rest of the entry point methodology is, while we're focused on entry point 1 today, just know that the other entry points are contracting, entry point 2. So you've selected the vendor, but now you need to develop the contract collaboratively, perhaps with the vendor. So that's entry point number 2. And then once you have that contract in place, then you roll into entry point 1, where you're still governing and controlling all the commercial terms of that contract you just developed. Entry point number 3 is kind of reaching all the way back into the beginning of the life cycle of the SOW, and that's the sourcing, the process of selecting a vendor. And for those of you who maybe aren't mature enough to actually doing strategic sourcing or competitive bidding, that's okay. You can still utilize the workflow and the concept to sole source, making sure that you're engaging the vendor in an appropriate way, that you're following proper due diligence checklists, that you're using the right templates, and that you're engaging approved suppliers as opposed to not yet approved suppliers. So entry point methodology is one of those that gives you those multiple, as the name suggests, multiple entry points into the SOW program, so that no matter what level of maturity your SOW spend or any defined segment of SOW spend you have in your organization, there is a pathway into the Flentis tool to help you, to add value to the remaining life cycle of that SOW. And that, again, is why we're talking about this here in a launch-based webinar, because we don't want people to think that you have to have a certain level of maturity, or you have to manage your SOWs in a certain way in order to get the full use out of a VMS or a MSP program like the one I'm building at eTeam. The reality is, the best VMS and program governance allows any and every SOW you want to put in there a pathway to value. And that, I'll step back and say, Laura, did I hit on all that? Daniel, did I hit on all that? Did I leave anything else out?
Daniel, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, you really did hit on a lot of those points in that answer there. But just to really overstate that, I think organizations, especially those immature ones, may see services procurement as kind of this big scary monster. There's so many complexities that can go into it. They don't even know where to start. And it's better to, kind of get started than not start at all, in my opinion. And with this entry point methodology and how we've built our VMS, you can certainly keep all of the rules for your services procurement as simple as possible to start. And then as you start to kind of scale up and your services procurement grows with your organization, you can configure those things to be more and more complex as you see fit and as it works for your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And for that purpose, we put that arrow at the bottom, kind of showing the maturity path of categories or procurement organizations and how they're managing it. And also to remind people that, SOW isn't a one size fits all in your organization. You don't purchase and consume all SOW based services the same way. So, Flentis has built a technology that enables you to engage it and manage it how you see fit, and we're not providing a technology that you have to change your processes to just to use the technology and get that visibility and control. So you can maintain your policies, you can maintain your source plans, you can maintain your segmentations. We'll help you build that out as you use the technology. But again, there should be no barrier to entry into a technology like this. it's by design that the Flentis team built it according to the entry point methodology.
So then, question for both of you, when is then the best time for an organization to get their SOW spend into a technology like this? It sounds like there's no better time than the present. Is that the case?
If not yesterday, then today.
Yeah.
uh,
Go ahead.
I said that jokingly, but the reality is you do need to have, it's an investment in money and time to engage a vendor management system and or a MSP program. So you don't want to do it if you have just $100,000 worth of SOW spend, or maybe do 2 SOWs a year. Obviously that would be overkill. But there's a lot of discussion in our industry, and there has been for the last 15, 20 years, about what's the right threshold of SOW spend that warrants putting a VMS in place or putting a MSP in place. And for every organization, I think that's going to be different. I think the more salient question is, at what point can you engage a trusted partner, a trusted VMS partner, to come in and help you support your level of SOW spend in a way that adds value to you, and importantly, they can meet their margins and be profitable in doing so, right? Because they're a business as well. But you don't want somebody who says you got to have 30 million before we even talk to you, right? You want something, I believe, and this is really geared toward the kind of the mid-market. You want a VMS that can come in and help you as you surpass that maybe 5 million worth of SOW spend that you're willing to put into the program. And obviously there's going to be some growth there. So that's when I would say the right time is either yesterday, today, or when you get to 5 million or above.
Perfect. Daniel, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would say so. For specifically doing an implementation with our technology, obviously it's important for the client organization to kind of go in with a plan, knowing what they want to achieve with the implementation, maybe having their spend in mind, kind of those things that Michael brought up. But it's also important to keep in mind that our fantastic implementation team is definitely there to kind of help the client through the entire process, really sit down and kind of be that consultative expert and help plan out not only the implementation, the short-term goal of that, but kind of the long-term and planning of their services procurement as well, and kind of do their best to consult and say, okay, maybe let's start here with these different configurations. Maybe these are some of the rules we should have. This is the best way to set things up. And this is going to really lay the good groundwork for you to be successful and expand easily in the future.
And I think that's important as well. And it's not something that we're touching on heavily in this webinar. We have in the past, but how your technology and service provider work together. I think it's very important that service provider understands the technology and that their implementation teams work well together and things like that. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, I'll say when it comes to managing SOW, getting a service provider that really understands what the maturity path looks for an organization that's wanting to apply better management strategies to their SOW spend. Because as we talked about, the entry point is that very basic layer, entry point 1, where you're getting in and just gaining visibility and control of the commercial terms within an SOW. But you're not doing that as the end game. I mean, that's not your final objective. The objective is to use that control and visibility to actually segment spend, to identify opportunities to go deeper into the savings within a particular category or subcategory of spend, to develop and execute against particular strategies for more critical, well-defined categories of spend. So, when you're choosing a service provider or when you're deciding to manage the spend internally, then recognize the power that a VMS gives you, and it's just a starting point. So if all you're looking to do is bring that 5 million in and gain visibility and control and not do anything else with it, okay, you can do that, but you're leaving so much on the table. And I think that's kind of what I would say when you're looking for a service provider or trying to make a decision internally. Get the right service provider, internal or external, to help you grow into a greater value set for your SOW management program.
So then, Michael, why do you think everything that we've talked about, how really any organization of any size or maturity can begin this process of implementing a program to manage their SOW spend, why do you think it is so often not included in a phase one of a contingent workforce implementation?
No, it's a great question, and one that all sides of our industry have sort of been trying to figure out or solve for for a long time. And I don't have any silver bullet solution or a great way to do it other than to recognize what's going on. So what I think is going on is, as we mentioned, the VMS and MSP program management of contingent labor really started with temp labor staff augmentation. And if you look at the clear stakeholder or ownership of that demand on the enterprise side, it's clearly HR. Today, we would say it's HR and talent acquisition, maybe IT still, obviously, because they generally have the highest need for contingent labor. So sometimes they were the key stakeholders. But when it came to SOW, when SOW came on the scene, the HR and the talent acquisition folks weren't as familiar, understandably so, with what to do with and how to manage and how to even talk about SOW or statement of work or professional services or how to manage consulting spend or offshore spend or development spend as opposed to managing temp labor. So that's where I think the wires got crossed a bit. And if you have a stakeholder set that isn't as familiar with the value and the opportunities of managing the SOW channel, you're really challenged to break through to make the decision to go with an SOW program. And that's why you see a lot of the sales force, the new business development folks, a lot of the activity from VMS, MSP providers really trying to respectfully expand the stakeholder group that they're selling to, because they know if they're talking to only HR and talent acquisition folks, and again, it's no disrespect whatsoever, but they just may not understand the conversation around SOW, and they may easily, and this is what has been happening in the past, say, you know what, yeah, I know SOW is important, but I'm really focused on staff aug. Okay, we understand that. And I don't think it's a bad thing to just start with staff aug either. I think that's a natural starting point. But I think what we see today is more RFPs that are actually including criteria and understanding of a provider's SOW capabilities, so that even if they're placing SOW as phase two, they're making the decision of the VMS or the MSP based on not just phase one and then figuring out what to do with phase two later. They're basing it on a two-step project which says, yes, phase one staff aug, but having a very defined phase two to start at some defined time to do SOW. I think that's a fair approach to it. If you're going into an organization that is really kind of chaotic with regards to managing contingent labor, and maybe they have a first generation, or they're not managing contingent labor in a coordinated fashion or governed fashion at all, doing a big bang for implementation for staff aug and SOW at the same time, there are some complexities there that I really do think should be taken seriously. But if you're in a second generation or a maturing organization that is looking to move over to kind of a whole new setup or new configuration of your program, there's no reason not to kind of look at staff augmentation and SOW in the same implementation. And especially with technology stacks of today, particularly like Flentis has, where you have the ability to configure a very standardized, almost out of the box kind of SOW solution. so that really all you have to do is start using it. It's not another implementation. It's simply, are you, or when you're ready, meaning the client organization, to start managing your SOW, it's there, ready, waiting for you to just start using it.
Absolutely. Daniel, is there anything that you wanted to, I know that's an implementation geared question kind of on the managed services side, but anything you want to add to that?
I think at the end, Michael, you touched a little bit on that kind of standard configuration and just out of the box solution. And, definitely our entire development team that here at Flentis that worked on this did a really great job of making that seamless and simple. Like you mentioned, if you're starting with staff augmentation and a typical next step is to move into services procurement, it's not a whole other implementation. It's simply kind of going into the admin, turning on a few switches, and really you're ready to go. We have all of those default settings there for you. And as you grow, you can kind of change those rules, upgrade them based on your complexity.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk then a little bit about, we've kind of gone through who's a good candidate for this type of program, how do you get the program set up? So let's talk a little bit about managing the program. And Michael, if you want to just share a little bit about your philosophy of how to actually manage this ongoing process.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, so back to my comment earlier about making sure that whether you're internally or externally managed, that your MSP or your service provider team that's focused on SOW really understands kind of the procurement / sourcing aspect of managing SOWs. It's really important that you understand that, because if you don't, then you might launch into like an entry point one and manage the compliance of the commercial terms, which again is good, but it won't give you the ability to sort of deepen those opportunities, create more efficiencies, create more visibility, segment the spend, and develop really meaningful vendor consolidation, vendor preference, and other strategic spend management strategies. So I think that is important to have somebody who understands that and is willing to, or is positioned to help you set up your program from the very beginning with that end game in mind, right? So if you go in and you configure just for today and the 100 SOWs that you envision, you want somebody that pushes your envelope out and expands your thinking, expands your understanding. So for instance, if an enterprise organization comes and talks to me about, hey, we want you to manage this, this bucket of spend that we have over here, or, it's not very mature and stuff like that. And that's great. We're going to say, yeah, we got a solution for that. But what we try to do is introduce opportunities and values or pain points that they might be having that they don't even realize yet. And one of the things is the SOW spend tail. A lot of organizations don't think about, the $50,000, the $75,000, or the smaller things, SOW engagements that are below that competitive bid or that sourcing engagement threshold. Well, that's what we generally refer to as the SOW spend tail, and that's generally totally unmanaged or severely undermanaged. So we always say, hey, why don't we start trying to get a handle on your SOW spend tail? Let's just focus on things that are $50,000 and above and get some visibility and control. Because if nothing else, you're still going to save on the AP play. You're going to create the visibility. You're going to identify opportunities to recognize that you have 50 consulting firms doing the same kind of work, and some vendor consolidation opportunities. That's what I would suggest. In the early terms of a new SOW program, is that you really focus not on today's pain points, although that's important, but looking and anticipating the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months or 2 years, and thinking from day one, how are we going to grow this program? Because if you're not thinking about how am I going to grow this program, then you're not visualizing and you're not preparing yourself for success. And if you're a procurement person, I'm speaking to you particularly, you should be looking at how do I bring in more SOW spend that is either or severely undermanaged currently today to extend my reach of procurement effectiveness, because your VMS is your tool. It is how procurement can extend its operations. So that's what I would recommend is don't start a new program without looking 12, 24 months out. Don't get distracted so that you delay or screw up the immediate implementation, but make sure that's part of your strategy. Because if it's not, you're just kicking the can down the road and you're not really seizing the highest and best value of starting a program.
Absolutely. So quick reminder to everyone, go ahead and submit your questions because we're getting up close to when we'll do the Q&A session at the end. Daniel, quick question for you before we get to that point. As you and your team were building out the services procurement module, a lot of the things that Michael just spoke about are considered when building out a technology is how is this actually going to be managed? Can you just talk a little bit about the process and like what you guys were considering in the build?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot to take into consideration with services procurement because just depending on the organization and their needs, it can be so complex or so simple. So like we've talked about, that's why we kind of built our system in a way to be configurable as possible for your specific organization's needs. So for example, when creating a statement of work, there's different fee drivers that are associated with that statement of work. So maybe a lot of your spend is going towards those statements of work that are just time and materials based. Okay, but what about fixed fees, periodic fees, deliverable based, right? Those are all other instances where the payment plan might need to be a little bit different. And that might change kind of as the services procurement within the organization grows. One year it might just kind of be all these different fixed fee statement of works, but then obviously things change, you progress, you're growing. Now, okay, let's get ready to make these a little bit more complex and turn these into time materials, track all the time of the resources who have been working on that project, making sure everyone gets paid out correctly. Or if this is a deliverable-based project and we want to make sure that once a deliverable is completed, right, there's an associated amount going out so things can be invoiced on time. And we've really built it in a way where it's all consolidated. So if you do have this very complex SOW, you don't need to create several different SOWs and then kind of merge them all into one. It can all be housed in one singular place, so you can easily manage, track, and report on it.
Fantastic. All right.
I like that too.
Is there anything that you wanted to add to that, Michael?
No, I'll just echo the importance of leveraging a technology like Flentis to keep all of your contingent labor spend in the same system of record and give yourself a single entry point for any kind of contingent labor need and the ability to provide that visibility control across labor channels and that reporting that allows you to be analytic. Because when a more mature organization is fully leveraging all those channels within a single system or a single program, then you really have the opportunity to do something that I think a lot of us have heard about but don't fully understand. It's called channel optimization. The ability to see a temp labor request that comes in and you say, well, wait a minute, we ask a few questions on the front end, and I know Flentis has this capability to do kind of like the decision tree routing to make sure it goes to a freelancer instead, or goes to a consulting firm if it has multiple deliverables, or vice versa, right? If you're putting a SOW in place, let's make sure that you're not just buying staff augmentation, because if you're buying staff augmentation, hey, we've got a really good set of preferred staffing suppliers for you to go get whatever skill set you need. So I just echo that having it all in one place is part of that end game that I was talking about earlier.
Amazing. All right, so we are at the end of the questions that I had. I have one last one. This is my favorite part of the webinar. Every time we do kind of from our speakers, one piece of advice that you would give to our audience. So in this case, If someone is setting up or enhancing their SOW management program, what is one piece of advice that you would give to them? And Michael, we'll start with you.
Well, you know, I've got lots of advice to give, but if I had to give just one piece of advice, I would say start today to find that VMS provider that can align with your current culture and your current operations and give you a pathway towards more desired processes and operations within your environment. If you've got a good VMS trusted partner, they will help you figure it out and they will give you the tools to make it work for your organization. And the flip side of that, because it's just as important, don't go with a technology or even a service provider, MSP service provider, that kind of requires you to align with their process, with their technology, with their limited capabilities. At VMS, one of my favorite sayings is, a VMS is a very strong tool. It can automate the heck out of some really bad processes if you want it to. Don't do that.
All right. And I love that you said that, because when we are considering what to build in our technology, we're like, well, we have to support the bad processes too, unfortunately. Daniel, what is your one piece of advice?
Yeah, my one piece would kind of go off of what you just said, Laura, really establishing those clear processes for yourself as the client, whether they're high level or, very granular in how maybe you manage, approve the SOW. Really understand what you want from your services procurement program. And then us as the VMS, we're here to kind of fit around you, make sure we're helping you in any way we can to effectively manage and help your organization grow.
Fantastic. All right, now on to the Q&A. So if there are any questions, we'll go ahead and throw them up on the screen and you guys can continue to ask some as we're going through this. The first one, how would you ensure that users have the necessary skills and knowledge to effectively use the platform? I think there's always two answers to this. I think the service provider plays a role in this, but Daniel, I will let you answer first from a technology perspective, and then Michael, you can give your answer as well.
Yeah, I mean, from a technology perspective, we really took into consideration kind of the simplicity in terms of building our VMS, right? It shouldn't be kind of a wild goose chase to find an approval, track down an item that's pending with you, right? It's very much kind of in your face exactly what the next step is, and exactly highlights where you are in the process, so you're not kind of stuck or lost or holding things up in that case.
Yeah, I would add on to that it's important to have a technology that is really thoughtful in defining user roles and rights, the ability to do everything that needs to be done, but then making sure that there's controls in place, and recognizing that there's a bit of a difference in how a hiring manager would interact with the platform to raise a requisition and select a resume or a contractor and then review approved timesheets and invoices. The activities or the tasks required of a hiring manager, their comparable hiring manager on the SOW side, is going to be a little bit different, potentially, especially if you have well-defined deliverables and acceptance criteria that need to be reviewed and approved. But also the sourcing is quite different, right? In developing the contract, it's not just a standard PO, it's a inherently unique contract with unique deliverables. So those roles have to be really thought out. And during implementation, your Flentis VMS and your eTeam MSP should help you identify those roles and then give each group, a representative group, the training they need to interact effectively with the tool.
Awesome. All right. Any other questions? Yes. How can a managed service provider help optimize your current SOW spend? Michael, sounds like a question for you.
Yeah, I love how you asked the question, how to optimize your current SOW spend. So the first thing that an MSP can do is to encourage expanding the program to include even more spend. And I know that sounds self-serving from a provider side because more spend means more revenue generally. But the reality is, if you're doing things right and your MSP is good and using a good technology like Flentis, then you, the customer, are really increasing your value by the more spend that you put into it. And you're optimizing your hiring managers, your operations time and energy in processing, engaging, consuming external labor. And then the other way I would suggest is what I mentioned earlier from an MSP perspective, making sure that if you've got SOW in scope of the MSP program, that there are somewhere along the way qualified procurement sourcing professionals to really help steer and guide not only the implementation and configuration of the Flentis VMS, but also help grow the account and analyze the spend that comes from it. Good question.
Wonderful. All right, one last question here. I know we're coming up on time. What are some of the latest trends and best practices in SOW management for freelancers?
Ooh, can I answer that one?
You sure can.
I love this question because it really is kind of a cornerstone of when I was working with the Flentis group and talking about, what should the scope of the SOW functionality be. And from day one, we really started thinking about, let's not limit ourselves to just corp to corp SOW, the general concept that people have. Let's make sure that we incorporate IC or freelancer SOW into that functionality. Because at the end of the day, managing IC SOW is the same as managing a corp to corp SOW with just a couple key differences, especially on the front end. On an IC SOW, you want to make sure you're engaging some kind of classification screening to make sure that they're a qualified and compliant IC. On the corp to corp side, you want to make sure that you're able to incorporate the due diligence from your customer into the workflow and into the onboarding, using the right templates and contracts. So the first response to your question is it should already be built into the SOW to use it for freelancers and ICs. And in Flentis, I know it is because we talked about it when we were working together, and I've seen a demo of it, and you can manage ICs as well as corp to corps in there. But the other thing I would mention is the ability to distinguish within within the freelancer space, right? Because not all freelancers should go to the IC, to the SOW route, because some freelancers are engaged just like temp staffing contractors for staff augmentation. So you want to make sure that you're properly screening and have a technology platform that can route it either to the IC SOW route or to the freelancer EOR, employer of record route, however that might be configured in your program. That's how I would incorporate. There's a lot more to that, but that's initially what I would say about freelancer SOWs.
And that's perfect. And of course, anyone in the audience is welcome to reach out to myself, Daniel, or Michael if you have further questions, or if there are questions that we didn't get to, we'll be going through those and reaching out as well. I want to thank Michael for being our guest on this webinar. I think it was one of the best ones that we've done. And Daniel, of course, thank you for joining as well. For those of you that are going to be at CWS next week, we will be there at booth 211. Both Daniel and I will be there along with some other members of our Flentis team. We've got some fun games and prizes at our booth if you guys want to stop by and say hi. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining, and we will see you at our next webinar.